It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays, well, they're for me to talk about monster movies. This week I decided to do a movie that I've seen on TV or various Roku channels over the years. The Mad Monster is a 1942 horror movie, and I'd say this is an example of how Universal horror films of the 30s and early 40s greatly influenced other film studios to try their damnedest to copy it. Even MGM attempted a movie called Mark of the Vampire that was directed by Todd Browning of Dracula fame and starred Bela Lugosi as a very Dracula-esque vampire. But there were a ton of old movies, particularly in the 40s, that seemed to really want to ride the coattails of Universal. Producers Releasing Corporation released The Mad Monster. They had not yet really dived headlong into trying to create cheap horror movies, but they were less than a year or so away from doing so. They had made a movie in 1940 called The Devil Bat that starred, you guessed it, Bela Lugosi. Well, here, Lugosi probably wasn't available, so PRC got George Zucco, who had been in a couple of Universal horror movies. They also got Glenn Strange, someone who'd eventually play the Frankenstein monster for Universal. They also got Reginald Barlow, who was in last week's movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, and Ann Nagel, who had been in Universal's Man-Made Monster with Lon Chaney Jr., who I'm going to talk a lot about before the end of this month. So yeah, PRC, part of the Poverty Row group of production companies that would crank out schlock, they really wanted to get some easy money off the Universal horror stuff. In a relatively unremarkable horror movie that has risen to some fame over the years because it is in the public domain, I do want to talk about George Zucco. Zucco was already a relatively well-known actor by the time he was in The Mad Monster. He was born in Manchester, England, and it was claimed that his mother was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria, but that actually was just a myth. She didn't actually hold a title in order to have been that closely associated with the Queen. He was a leading man in the 20s on stage in the UK, and by the mid-30s, he had made his way stateside and scored the role of the heavy Professor Moriarty in the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce Sherlock Holmes series of movies. Ultimately, he worked rather steadily until he retired due to declining health in 1951, and through the 50s, he sadly battled dementia before passing away in an assisted living home from pneumonia in 1960. As it turns out, his wife Stella actually lived to the year 1999, where she was 99 years old. He's an exceptionally talented character actor. He likely would have remained somewhat of a leading man in the UK, but really, if you wanted to be in film, you almost had to come over to America back then. The movie begins with Zucco as Dr. Cameron in his spooky lab. He's got a caged wolf and his slow-witted gardener Pietro, who's played by Strange, and Pietro is strapped to a bed. He's taken some blood from the wolf and injects it into Pietro's arm, and after injecting him, Cameron watches the man transform into a werewolf-like guy. Cameron then talks to people at a table who are really more like ghostly images, and he's kind of reenacting a conversation claiming that using these wolf guys as a military force, they could really really sell it to the military and potentially have a pretty strong army, if you will. But his colleagues just really kind of think he's just a complete wacko. So Cameron decides to levy an atomic bomb of a threat on them. Force me out, and I'll see to it that you are killed by the very scientific experiment you scoffed at. That's a pretty big threat to make, and apparently they really just kind of thought that he was that much of an insane wacko at that point that they didn't even really bother to call the authorities or get any extra protection or anything like that. Now, Lenora, Cameron's daughter, wants to leave and return to their regular home, But Dr. Cameron just says that they will not be leaving until his work is done. In kind of a sweet little scene, Pietro picked some flowers for Lenora as a sign of friendship, and she asked the big old lug what he does with her father in the lab. And Pietro says that he really can't tell because he doesn't know who that person would tell and so on. But Lenora says she won't tell anyone. And just as he is about to spill the beans about the work they do, Cameron approaches and tells Pietro to go to the lab. There, Pietro wolfs out and is let loose. And that night, Pietro kills a girl, proving his experiment is, one, a success, and two, will allow for Cameron to now turn his monster on those former colleagues who shamed him. After that area kid and some of the jerk doctors wind up dead, Pietro talks to Lenora and says that he's been having these terrible dreams. She herself seems overly worried about the various nighttime wildlife she hears. And when Lenora's boyfriend, a reporter who is covering the murders, shows up, Cameron kind of chases him off, making Lenora worried for his safety. But as it so turns out, reporter Tom ends up at the home of the dead kid's father, who tells Tom about the scary beast that seemed to walk on two legs that scared off his friend and mauled his daughter. Problems arise as Cameron realizes that Pietro can turn into a wolf without the docs knowing. While he is still somewhat able to command Pietro, he's starting to get a little worried about Pietro becoming too hard to control and ultimately really dangerous. Later, another one of the scientists who ridiculed Cameron is invited over to be shown a breakthrough that he's made, quote unquote. However, he still thinks Cameron is a nut. And when he leaves, Cameron asks if the scientist would drive his gardener to town. The intent, of course, is for Pietro to transform in the car and ultimately kill that scientist. He transforms, but doesn't actually quite finish the job. He's scared off by the reporters and some locals hunting the beast. And Tom brings the attacked scientist back to the Camerons. Tom says that when the town doctor can check him out, they will finally learn who or what has been committing these murders. Before the town's doctor can get there, Cameron is able to slip into the room where the scientist is and kills him. Elsewhere in the house, Lenora finds her father's lab and eventually lets in the wolfed out Pietro and is nearly attacked by him. Lightning strikes the home and the house catches fire, and while the house burns, Pietro kills Dr. Cameron while Tom and Lenora escape, leaving Pietro to die in the fire. So let's get to my three things that I like about this movie. First, while the performances are all fairly good, I especially like Zucco's Dr. Cameron and Strange's Pietro. Zucco is really good as a heavy. He can also come off as threatening and a little intimidating for being kind of an older actor. Zucco's mad scientist is fairly standard in a stock bad guy kind of way of that era, but his name maybe added a little extra prestige to the movie. As for Glenn Strange, his simpleton gardener turned monster is really pretty sympathetic. He's very kind and sweet with Lenora, and it's sad to think how Cameron kind of uses him as an instrument of revenge. Worse, he's additionally sympathetic because this guy was tinkered with only to die horribly in a house fire. Next, I kind of like this different take on a werewolf. Basically, they made the Wolfman without it being the Wolfman who turns into a werewolf at the full moon. Instead, you have a man-made werewolf. He's got a unique look that is not trying to copy another version of a werewolf. The transformation effects are fairly decent, too, for a small-budget movie. And there's a really great transformation when that scientist guy leaves angry from Cameron's place and he's driving Pietro to town. Pietro's head is down because he's kind of drugged up by Cameron, or he's not feeling very well or something. I don't quite remember seeing like an obvious edit, but about 10 seconds later, with the camera still on him, he lifts his head and he's in his full werewolf makeup. It's a pretty solid transformation, and I definitely appreciate trying to do that transformation thing a little different than what had been seen up to that point. Lastly, this movie had exactly what I wanted it to have for it to be selected for this October of Spooky Black and White Movies theme. It has atmosphere to spare. It's a plantation house way out in the middle of nowhere, so it's super dark. For some reason, it's really, really foggy that week in which the movie takes place. Late in the movie, there's a thunderstorm with lightning and such. It's what I look forward to seeing in movies around Halloween, and if nothing else, I'm just glad to have an ooky spooky movie with lots of dark, foggy, and stormy nights. The Mad Monster isn't exactly well regarded. It's generally thought of as a pretty low budget and kind of bland, all things considered. However, there are some decent things to point out, and hell, at only about 78 minutes in length, most anyone should be able to stick it out. The movie is obviously made on a really tight budget, as there are only about a half dozen people ever seen in the movie, and there only seems to be 3 sets: the house, the outside grounds around the big house, and the lab. However, all that said, it's brief runtime and the actors all really kind of go for it in this movie. May not quite have been everybody's cup of tea, but it's far from some of the worst stuff I've ever seen in my life. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. And also be sure to check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday morning.